Sadly, this is only one example. Yesterday, Elon Musk led his first cabinet meeting of this administration. He admitted that DOGE's approach has led to many erroneous cuts to staff and programs that are not wasteful, but on the contrary, vital. For example, he said, with USAID, one of the things we accidentally canceled was very briefly, was Ebola prevention. Those are his words. Mr. President, are you kidding me? Cutting funds to stop one of the deadliest diseases in the world is reckless, especially when there's an Ebola outbreak in Uganda as we speak, and flights from Kampala leave Kampala every day and go all over the world. When epidemics hit America, they oftentimes begin abroad, and U.S. funding is essential to prevent those diseases from reaching us here at all. I should also note that the claims that Ebola funding is back online are false. Reports are out from last night that 95% of all USAID funding is now being cut. So we're not sure where it all is. Mr. President, what DOGE is doing is not what efficiency looks like. If DOGE actually cares about efficiency and meritocracy, then it's failing in many ways its own test. It would be better to look at these programs, see which might be wasteful, see which are needed, and then make the cuts to the wasteful programs. Not take a meat axe, a blowtorch, call it what you will, cut everything, and then say, we'll restore some of the things that we shouldn't have cut. Because once you make those cuts, it's very hard to put the pieces back together. On Republican taxes. Last month, consumer confidence took its biggest nosedive in 4 years. Biggest nosedive in 4 years. This is how confident consumers, average Americans, feel about the economy. Inflation is trending back up. The price of eggs is sky high. The threat of a trade war looms over our country. And Americans are fearful that things are not going to get any better anytime soon. And what are Republicans doing about all of this? They're trying to cut taxes for billionaires, and make the American people pay for it. The Republican agenda is quickly taking shape. Under Donald Trump's Republican Party, billionaires win, American families lose. It doesn't matter if Republicans go with one bill or 2 bills or 50 bills. That's what they're debating right now. Their end game, House and Senate Republicans, has always been cutting taxes for billionaires and forcing American families to pick up the tab. Of course, Senate Republicans know that cutting Medicaid by over $800 billion to lower taxes for billionaires is wildly unpopular. They know that increasing the deficit by up to $5 trillion to help the ultra-rich contradicts everything the so-called party of fiscal responsibility stands for. They say they have to cut all this stuff to reduce the deficit, and then with their tax breaks for billionaires, they increase the deficit, no matter what sleight-of-hand accounting method they use. What are Republicans doing about fiscal responsibility? Are they admitting that their plans would be a disaster for the deficit? Nope. Instead, Senate Republicans are engaged in budgetary hocus-pocus to hide the true costs of their tax cuts for the ultra-rich. And there may be signs that House Republicans are going along. Instead of admitting the truth about the consequences of their plans, they're pursuing a gimmick called current policy baseline, a gimmick if there ever was one, which is essentially an attempt to magically turn $5 trillion of deficit spending into $0 of deficit spending. Well, that can happen and doesn't happen, and the economy will realize it doesn't happen. Any junior high school math student could tell you this is a bunch of bunk. You can't pass $5 trillion to cut taxes for the rich and pretend like it doesn't affect the deficit. The issue isn't complicated. Republicans are trying to hide the true cost of their billionaire tax cuts from the American people. Meanwhile, they're getting ready to eviscerate funding for health care that serves over 80 million Americans, kids, seniors, rural communities. These cuts to Medicaid will dramatically hurt rural America, people with disabilities, and more. And the only people who seem to be opposing this is the Hard Right Freedom Caucus, because they seem to really care about the deficit. Let's hope they stay strong for the sake of the economy of this country. Of course, the American people are not going to take these Medicaid cuts lying down. Last night I got on a Zoom. Over 3,000 New Yorkers worried about the attacks from Republicans on health care got on the Zoom. Many more than we expected. But these were rank-and-file folks, health care advocates, union members, and concerned citizens from all walks of life. They were all upset about the cuts to Medicaid and putting those cuts in place in order to give tax breaks for billionaires. It was a great call. It was an energizing call. I urge my colleagues to do the same, as many of them are. It's a stark reminder of what's at stake, but also a reminder that the American people don't like these cuts. We've heard from New Yorkers who are in danger of having their Medicaid coverage taken away if Republicans proceed with their actions on this Zoom of over 3,000 people. But we also talked about taking action. I urge participants to call their members of Congress. I urge them to mobilize online and to organize in their communities. We urge everyone to make their voices heard, like we're seeing in the town hall meetings. I reminded folks that organizing is not easy, but it works. It changes things, and it's going to make a difference in making sure Medicaid is protected. And on our Education Secretary nominee. Today, the Senate will vote on whether to advance the nomination of Linda McMahon as Secretary of Education. Ms. McMahon's nomination comes as President Trump has been clear about cutting funding for education and abolishing the Department of Education entirely. Is Ms. McMahon going to go along? I hope not. Cutting education is not what the American people want. The American people don't want a radical, out-of-touch billionaire slashing funding for public schools. When you slash federal funding for education, guess what happens? Since so many of our school districts, urban, suburban, rural, depend on this federal money, it leads to higher property taxes for people back home. If you eliminate the Department of Education as a whole, that means local communities are forced to pick up the tab to fund the schools. It means that families in these communities will pay in the form of higher property taxes to make up the loss of federal funding. But communities will also be forced to slash other programs to make room for funding for schools. Again, this is not what the American people want. This is not what they voted for. Ms. McMahon, in my judgment, is not qualified to lead America's public education. She seems not to care very much about it. But that's precisely why President Trump nominated her. She's the perfect choice to bring our public education system burning to the ground. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.